This episode is brought to you by Olson, a planning and design firm that sees infinite possibilities in every project. Their integrated services deliver infrastructure solutions that make their communities more livable, sustainable, accessible, and connected. Where most firms see corridor and master plans, Olson sees welcome home hugs and vibrant neighborhoods. Olson, engineering possibilities. You're listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome back, bookworms, to another episode of Booked on Planning. In this episode, we talk with authors David Rouse and Rocky Piro about their book, The Comprehensive Plan, Sustainable, Resilient, and Equitable Communities for the 21st Century. As I read through the first section, I especially thought this book was a great read for students or young planners or those just kind of getting into comprehensive planning. It does a really good job of introducing the reader to concepts and laying it all out. It also, though, could be a good read for seasoned planners, especially the later sections, because it really dives into the equity, sustainability, and resiliency approaches that the comprehensive plans of the past had either ignored or really failed to integrate well.
I had the same thought. Actually, as I was reading through, there were many times where I marked a page and was like, God, I wish that I had this book when I was first starting out. Would have made my first planning job a lot easier. And yeah, as a seasoned planner, I certainly learned a lot in comprehensive planning development from this book.
And we mentioned that in the episode, as part of season 1, we covered the books that were on the recommended reading list for ASCP exam prep. And episode 3 was community planning with author Eric Damian Kelly. It was a comprehensive planning book, but it was published back in 2000. So while it was a really great episode with Eric, if you listen to that episode, and then you listen to this episode, you'll notice the differences and the real need for this book as an update to bringing comprehensive planning guidance and literature up to date into the 21st century. Because so much has happened in the past 2 decades and the focus has really shifted so much, I think David and Rocky's book really came at a good time.
When David and Rocky were talking about all of the advancements in planning since Eric's book, like you said, in the last 20 years, I was thinking, I wonder what future planners will say in the next 20 years about this book and maybe even our podcast. So we might want to consider more frequent updates in comp plan literature.
That is a really good point. Well, let's get into our conversation with David and Rocky on the comprehensive plan. David and Rocky, thank you so much for joining us on Booked on Planning to talk about your book, The Comprehensive Plan, Sustainable, Resilient, and Equitable Communities for the 21st Century. In your book, you talk about how it grew out of your work on the comprehensive plan standards for sustaining places. And I think it's really setting the standard for how all comprehensive plans should be built in the future. I will say that your book touches on so many topic areas, as a comprehensive plan should, that we won't be able to get into them all today. So at a high level, can you talk about your work on the standards and how they led to this book?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, and I'll respond, since I have really been involved in APA's Sustaining Places initiatives and the development of standards from the beginning. I do think it's one of the most significant contributions APA has ever made to professional practice. The Sustaining Places initiative was actually launched in 2010 by Paul Farmer, who was then CEO, and Bruce Knight was president of APA, and the idea was to define the role of planners and the comprehensive plan in advancing sustainability. So I won't get into a lot of detail. There is a whole history of how this developed, and as part of it, around 2015, APA published a PAS report called Sustaining Places, Best Practices for Comprehensive Plans, which I co-wrote with the late Dave Gottschalk. And that really laid out a series of principles, processes, and what we called attributes. Dave referred to those as plan-making design standards, which set a national standard for, or benchmark for, excellence in comprehensive planning, including sustainability, but going beyond that to cover everything really comprehensively what should be included in the plan. So To make a long story short, I was APA Research Director from 2013 to 2019. And about when I was leaving, Rocky and I started talking about, well, can we develop a book on comprehensive planning? We really saw there was a gap in the literature. There wasn't really anything current. So this book came out of that. And just to wrap up, we use the standards, the APA's Comp Plan standards, as a starting point for our book, but we really went well beyond them to lay out sort of what we see that is needed for comprehensive planning to promote truly resilient, sustainable, and equitable communities.
Yeah, that's a good point about there being a real gap in the literature, because we covered the one book that related to comprehensive planning called Community Planning in our first year of episodes, but that book is over 10 years old and so much has happened since that book came out that I think this book really fills the gap and does a good job of bringing it comprehensive planning up to date.
Yeah, you're right. That was a good book. It was by Eric Damian Kelly, but you're exactly right. It just needed something new needed to be developed to address really what's been happening in the last 10 to 20 years in society and in practice.
So one thing I noticed when I was taking notes, as I do for each of these episodes, is that I wrote the same question down twice, and that was how you came up with all these case studies. I know you do a lot of research to compile the standards, and curious if you're just Googling comprehensive plans or methodically looking through each state, or how do you come up with all these different case studies?
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, and I think that's a good issue for us to address. As David mentioned, he's a seasoned researcher, having served as the research director for APA. I just retired as director of the Colorado Center for Sustainable Urbanism, and also had an appointment as a research professor at the University of Colorado. So David and I are both researchers with a strong interest in current trends in planning. So we came into this project knowing quite a bit about what the lay of the land was like with the current generation of comprehensive planning. So we had already compiled lists. We also were in contact with fellow planners and researchers. We got some recommendations when we talked to them about this project here. We did conduct some research as well. And again, our intent was to really highlight state-of-the-art practices with examples from all sorts of communities across the U.S., small town, mid-sized and larger cities, urban and rural counties, and everywhere from the West Coast to the East Coast, North and South.
And to follow up on that, what are some of the top case study plans that you think are the gold standard for future comprehensive plans?
Oh, that's a challenging question. We looked at literally well over 100 plans. So we're seeing some great things happening across the board. We highlighted about 60 local plans as case studies that are particularly noteworthy in addressing different facets of the systems-based sustainable planning approach that we advocate in the book. In addition to those case studies, there's dozens and dozens of other local plans that are doing some cutting edge work that we note and mention in the book as well. So while a lot of communities are evolving into what we are calling the systems-based paradigm, I'd say some of the more notable plans are, like Asheville and Raleigh in North Carolina, Memphis, Austin in Texas, Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, San Diego County, Portland, Oregon, and Minneapolis.
Rocky, you gave some good examples there, but I'd like to note one thing, which is I think, Jennifer, you referred to gold standard for the future of comprehensive plans. And Rocky gave examples of really good examples of contemporary plans. But one of our points in the book is we think that the comprehensive planning has to evolve further to really address the issues of the 21st century in a significant way, which is why we concluded with a chapter called The Future of the Comprehensive Plan, in which we highlighted 5 themes in which we think more development is needed in practice. Those are equity engagement, climate change mitigation and adaptation, climate change being the existential threat of the 21st century. Systems thinking, Rocky's referred to that, but even though their plans are moving in that direction, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. People-centered technology is big, and effective implementation is another one. We'll talk about this later, I'm sure, but We think the weakest part of contemporary practice is lack of really strong implementation in most cases. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's no gold standard out there yet for a comprehensive plan of the future. And I particularly like their community engagement process. They developed a detailed civic engagement plan up front that sets clear goals and outcomes. And they follow that throughout the process and use a range of creative engagement techniques that are reflected in the plan. So that's just one example of a number of good ones.
Stephanie, you worked on the Minneapolis plan, right?
I was in development review, so
Oh, too cool.
Oh, you worked in Minneapolis.
Yeah,
That's
so
great.
I saw all the good work that our long range planners were doing and tried to provide some feedback where they needed it. But I can attest that a good plan like that takes a lot of work and a lot of coordination. So
I'll just add, maybe, I think the other thing that's really intriguing about Minneapolis is the ongoing relationship that regional planning has with local planning there. I mean, it's very symbiotic, that a lot of energy is put into the regional plan, as you mentioned, Stephanie. It takes a lot of work. And then, I mean, that immediately feeds into updates and amendments to the local plan. So that's a very fascinating and noteworthy process in the Twin Cities.
One of the very first topics that you touch on is a range of planning theories. I actually am a bit of a theory nerd myself, and I think that planners often study theory in school and then they don't ever really think about the impacts of planning theory again. So I was wondering if you could discuss the impact of planning theory on the future of comprehensive planning process. Do you think it still has a place?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I think it's really important for planners to understand how theory has evolved over the years. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, one thing we do in the book is go back through the history of the comprehensive plan and how it evolved actually originally from the City Beautiful movement and Daniel Burnham's 1909 plan for Chicago. And here's a little known fact. There was a manual of the plan of Chicago that was required reading in civics classes for Chicago public school 8th graders in the teens and the 20s. So planning was considered important back then as it was emerging. Now, what happened, as we know, is in the post-World War II period in particular, this rational planning method evolved. Analytical, top-down, planner as expert is one way of looking at it. And that was epitomized. T.J. Kent actually wrote a book, The General Plan, in 1964 that really lays this out. And there's still a basis, a strand of the rational method in the work that we do, for example, in the inventory analysis. As planning practice evolved in the second and the later 20th century, the 1980s vision planning evolved, values planning, which is actually something I practiced at WRT, Wallace Robertson Todd, in the 1990s. And what we saw happening was the idea of community values is expressed through the planning process, becoming really important and key to developing a meaningful plan and to inform like vision, goals, strategies, and implementation. So there's this evolution over time. A couple of other theories that are worth mentioning are, for example, advocacy planning, Paul Davidoff, incremental planning. And these all have a place and a role, and you'll find them reflected in contemporary practice. And I do think it's important for planners to understand these and think about them as we develop new methods going forward.
Some of the conversation, dialogue, consulting that I do with local governments who continue to kind of use a rational theory-based approach to planning, to deal with topics individually and fully, but not necessarily connect across topics and themes. So, I've had planners and elected officials talk about, well, that's the way we do it. It's spelled out in our statutes or something to go through and do it item by item, topic by topic. How do we make the adjustment? How do we evolve into more of a systems-based approach? And I think one of the things that we do in the book is not just lay out the systems model, but we walk through how you can continue to deal with the array of issues that might be codified in statute or a local municipal charter or something like that, and continue to address those requirements while evolving into something that's much more integrated, holistic, and recognizes that communities really are systems of systems.
So building on that systems approach, you talk about the ecosystems approach, which is, as you mentioned, very different than how we traditionally have been planning, with the built environment and nature as completely separate, independent things. And you stress the importance of seeing all aspects of nature's impact on development, including land, water, air, climate, and flora and fauna. Can you discuss the ecosystem approach and how it can be incorporated into comprehensive plans? And then whether you've seen any case studies that integrate this approach really well as opposed to the kind of silo approach?
You're right. I mean, and David did a masterful job kind of talking about the history of planning, those original efforts to start to talk about systems, if you will, often linked to open space, mobility, and housing. Again, as planning evolved in the 20th century, new issues came into play: economic development, social challenges, the environmental movement, and so on. And I mean, you're right, Stephanie. We tended to do that in silos. I've done a lot of work recently with integrating health into planning and the built environment. And I have to say, sometimes I'm embarrassed a little bit that health was a foundational issue in the early 20th century for justifying why we needed planning. But that too, we kind of got on separate tracks with it. And so, it's very welcome to bring health, for example, back into play here. So the ecosystems model, I think, serves well as a way to integrate things. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about the natural environment, we're talking about looking at whole natural systems, whether it's a watershed or another type of ecosystem here, and bringing all the factors into play. So soils, water, air, and climate. You look deeper at issues where you may have, damaged environment with polluted lands, with contaminated water, and so on. And how do you move forward, in an integrated approach that heals and restores and makes the ecosystem much more functional, healthy for humans, healthy for wildlife and plant life, and so on. So that's kind of the gist of the ecosystems thing. And again, I think our point is to take that model and to now look at it as a system among systems. So, we focus a lot when we're talking about the natural environment on the ecosystem I just described, but the built environment is a set of systems. So development patterns, our mobility system, various other types of infrastructure, even issues such as design and historic preservation are part of that system. The social systems, issues around environmental justice, social services, housing, I would put into that category as well. And then we're very conscious about talking about economic systems in terms of economic opportunity and economic resiliency to kind of evolve away from historic understanding of economic development as just constantly finding new growth opportunities for the future of a community. That isn't necessarily something that can be done across the board. We have communities that have stable populations. We have communities that are declining in population. So, I mean, for them, their future to be sustainable, resilient, and equitable means looking at more realistic ways to approach economic opportunity with a different paradigm from what they maybe had in the 20th century.
I think it's true that Jon Snow, the 19th century physician, should actually be as much of a household name as Jon Snow, the Game of Thrones character, since the original Jon Snow did so much for health and community planning.
I mean, one of the things we're seeing right now in terms of recognizing the importance of integrating various facets of natural systems is happening in a number of communities throughout the West, particularly the Southwest right now, that are understanding they need to relate climate with water, with development patterns and land use and so on, along with the preservation and enhancement of natural areas. So we're very much seeing that evolve. As someone who grew up in the West and has had my whole career in the West, I know 50 years ago, when I first started to get interested in planning and environmental issues, I mean, we were talking water scarcity and the need to better manage water then. And we often said we're going to hit a crisis point if we don't do it. Well, I think the crisis point has hit us now, and we're very much in a very proactive mode to figure out how to be much more sensible, sustainable, and effective with water management and how it impacts so many other planning issues.
Part two of that question would be whether you have any case studies of communities that integrate the approach well, as opposed to working in silos.
I would offer Stearns County, Minnesota, as a good example that actually dates back to the early 2000s. I found out about this, by the way, in a book published by Island Press called Principles of Ecological Landscape Design, in which they actually feature what Stearns County did way back 20 years ago in the book. And apparently the county has an area of about 80 square miles that's particularly significant in terms of its ecological resources, and they were threatened by development. So there was a community planning process that they did. It was led by the Nature Conservancy and local partners and stakeholders, which developed a vision and strategies for natural resource protection in this area. And I'm going to bring this up to the present day because we do feature the latest comp plan by Stearns County in our book. But what happened was around 2008, the county developed a comprehensive plan, and that vision and strategies for conservation of natural resources were incorporated into that plan and applied countywide. Now, fast forward 10, 12 years, in 2020, the county adopted a new comprehensive plan called Shape Stearns 2040, which Rocky and I found, actually that was through just Google research, and we were really impressed by it. And it's a good example of comprehensive planning for a relatively rural county area, not a city. And in that plan, they identified 5 pillars that was the basis for their vision statement and also strategies and actions. And nature is identified as one of the 5 pillars. And beyond that, they included a plan appendix that had a very detailed, what they call a natural resource manual, which has information on all those natural resources that Rocky was talking about: geology, topography, soils, hydrology, and vegetation. And they make the point in that manual is this is a resource that, for example, county officials can use in making decisions and for other purposes. So I think Stearns County is a really good example of integrating natural resources into the comprehensive plan.
As we've emphasized, and you emphasize throughout the book, it's important to take the systems approach when considering comprehensive planning. And as you actually mentioned before, Nebraska's planning process is laid out in statute. And so as I was reading through the book, I kept thinking how I could incorporate these systems approaches as I met our statutory requirements. What tips would you give planners who work in areas that might either be wary of adopting the systems approach, or, they have the statutory layout, and so they're trying to make those connections as they work within their legal frameworks?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Jennifer. Yeah, as we stated already, we're aware that, many jurisdictions have fallen into the pattern of just developing individual plans oftentimes for individual topics, in addition to comprehensive plans that are just kind of topical, that go to one issue, then move to another, and so on. We're actually aware, we saw this with some of our research, that there are jurisdictions that have adopted plans over time, and they continue to adopt plans, and there isn't always a clear understanding of which plans are active at a particular point in time. I know we looked at a couple of jurisdictions in my home state of Colorado that actually have dozens and dozens of municipal-wide plans. It's just not a clear understanding of how these plans relate to each other. So I'd say, if for no other reason, having a single unified comprehensive plan document that's organized around foundational issues of sustainability, equity, and resiliency allows you to address the full array of issues in a single resource that makes it much more usable for elected officials, staff, and for the community itself. And that sort of evolution to a more unified, integrated approach really lends itself well to genuine community engagement and authentic public participation, which David touched on a little earlier in our conversation here. So while addressing the complexity of all these relationships does require a lot of work, I mean, I think in the long run, the result is a plan that's much easier to use and apply and implement.
Yeah, if I could add just a couple of things to what Rocky just said. We know the traditional model of the comprehensive plan is organized around elements, land use, transportation, et cetera, that tended to be silos. You'd even have different firms, consulting firms, for preparing different elements sometimes, or departments of a jurisdiction. But their plans are still done that way, particularly where state legislation sets that direction. But what we're seeing more and more in contemporary practice is plans being organized around cross-cutting themes that come out of the community engagement process that cut across these separate silos or elements. So a good example of that, actually, I mentioned Stearns County, Minnesota as being an example of that, and there are many others that we saw and we highlighted in our book. For example, Portsmouth, Virginia had, I think, 3 or 4 themes in their vision statement. And those themes, and I can't remember exactly what they were, equity, resilience, and a couple more, but they were carried through the plan goals, strategies, and actions. So the action plan was actually organized around the 4 cross-cutting themes that were set in the vision.
So jumping back to the early chapters, you discuss how many comprehensive plans give you the summary of the where we are now, but they don't really go beyond answering the basic question. It really just ends up being a quick history lesson on what the community has done, but really misses the opportunity to go a step further and ask what's good about the community in order to build on that, or what went wrong in order to fix it. What are some examples of cities that have done this extra analysis well, and how's it helped them in their long-range planning efforts?
That's a great question. And, I have a deep appreciation for history. I actually majored in history as a graduate. But as I've come to realize, actually, in large part in writing this book, that the typical comprehensive plan just gives lip service to the past, kind of starts, where are we now? And then thinks about the future. I think is not the right approach. You need to come to a reckoning with the past and acknowledge it in the plan and moving forward. So there are 3 questions that the planning process is typically structured around. Where are we now and where are we headed? What do we want to be and how do we get there? So we would add the question right up front, where have we been? What's our past? To understand sort of the history and how we got here and what the issues are that we need to address, and the influence which can be either positive or negative. So obviously positive are like the historic legacy, cultural resource, in many places, rich history or cultural resources. But we know the negatives too, things like structural racism, impacts of urban renewal, highway construction, et cetera. So again, what we need to do is we think we need to acknowledge those influences, honestly lay them out and address them moving forward. And I think you asked about examples where this would be done. I'd give a couple of examples. I was thinking about this. First is Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where I've actually done a lot of work as a practicing planner. Lancaster County is a predominantly rural county. It's really known for its agricultural landscape, small towns, historic urban center, Lancaster City, and for the cultural legacy of its plain sect, Amish and Mennonite communities. Those resources really set the identity of the county, and they've done a lot of planning over the years, and there's been consensus across segments of the community, from environmentalists to developers, builders, that we need to preserve these resources moving forward. So they lay this out as a basis for their planning efforts. Most recently, they did a great comprehensive plan in-house, Places 2040 comprehensive plan, that lays out the strategies, urban growth areas, rural, designated agricultural rural areas to get there. And they have perhaps the most effective agriculture, at least one of the most effective agricultural preservation programs in the country.
I just worked with a consultant here in the Seattle area about a week ago, or just had a conversation, just met up with her, who's working on helping a community revise its vision statement as it starts an update for its comprehensive plan. The previous vision statement was like 6 pages, and we kind of sat down and looked at it. I said, well, this is actually more of an executive summary than an actual vision statement. So we worked through some of the concepts that, David described here to really try to bring it down to something that's powerful, easy to state, easy to understand and navigate, but provides that really rich kernel then to continue the work on the comp plan update.
Yeah, it would be really hard, I think, to implement a 6-page vision statement. And implementation, of course, is actually the key to a successful comprehensive plan. I know that many planners like to say, we don't just plan for no reason. We plan so that we have an ability to implement that plan. And implementation has evolved so much over the last 10 years. It's one of the many distinguishing factors between, I think, the 20th century and the 21st century for planning. And you outline 4 levels of implementation in the book. Can you talk about how you landed on these and how a city can use them?
Actually, that levels of implementation model goes back to maybe 10 years ago or so. That I developed that with Garner Stoll, who at the time was the deputy planning director for the city of Austin, and we worked together on the Imagine Austin comprehensive plan. I do think it's a really good model. What we're trying to do was understand what is involved in an effective implementation program and what are the major components. As you mentioned, there are 4 levels that we identified. And by the way, the foundation is community engagement. Community engagement is foundational to the comprehensive plan. So you have to have that as a baseline. And the comprehensive plan standards actually make the point that it's not during the planning process, but you should engage the community in implementation as well. So with community engagement as a foundation, the 4 levels are quickly regulations, capital investment, organizational alignment, that's within the local government, between departments. You think that would be a no-brainer, but as we all know, departments tend to be siloed. And finally, external partnerships outside the local government. They're arranged in approximate order of difficulty, so they kind of form a hierarchy from that standpoint. The thinking being that the first thing planners can do to implement a plan is, change a zoning ordinance and zoning map. And that's often almost as far as it gets in terms of implementation, but each level beyond that gets more and more difficult. So the idea is that they're kind of a hierarchy, but they're also should be used in tandem together to effectively implement a plan. So they're interrelated. They should be applied synergistically to achieve those outcomes you want. So I'll give one example. So Austin, obviously level 1 is revising the zoning ordinance, which I think they're still working on right now, actually. But level 2 that they've been very effective at, which is capital investments. They set up a capital improvement office that basically manages the process across departments to prioritize implementing the comprehensive plan and capital investments. And they've done a great job on level 3 too, to implement the plan. So they set up interdepartmental working groups led by different departments. The planning department was involved in all of them to implement what were called priority programs. For example, Healthy Community was one priority program led by the health department. And I'll say one last thing, level 4, external partnerships, we found was the most difficult to actually pull off. And we didn't find any good examples of what we think is like the holy grail in that, which is to bring a bunch of partners together internally and externally and work together on an ongoing basis on implementation rather than piecemeal by partnership. So we're still looking for a good example of that. And that's an example of how comprehensive planning could evolve in the future.
What I might add is implementation needs to be understood in that process from the get-go. So you don't just work through a plan and, okay, now here are our actions. Now we're going to talk about implementation. I mean, to be thinking of implementation from the outset and throughout the process means that the goals you set, the policies you craft, as well as the action steps, all are done with a view towards how can this be implemented. And I love the 4-level model. I think that gets into a lot of rich detail. Unfortunately, a lot of times you see implementation articulated just in terms of, well, here's some actions we need to do, but you need to go the distance, as David just talked about. I mean, you need to identify who's going to be doing that, whether it's in the planning department, whether it's in partnership with other agencies in a jurisdiction, whether it's with outside partners. That needs to be understood. Where are the resources coming from? I think that's something you have to be thinking about as well, all the way through the implementation process. Unfortunately, there are many examples of places where the zoning code and the whole zoning process is done in almost a separate arena from the plan itself. So there isn't always that alignment. That's critical, what David talked about. I mean, your regulations and other steps that you're going to take to implement the policies, the zoning code and that whole family of regulations needs to be fully consistent with the plan and not just done as another exercise of local government.
Yes, very true. And as I mentioned when we started this conversation, the book covers so many topics that we didn't dive into probably half of them in this conversation, but instead we kind of covered high level key themes of the book and kind of what people can expect. But to wrap up the episode, is there anything that we didn't cover that you think is really important for our listeners, or any messages you wanted to end with?
Yeah, I can think of one, and then maybe Rocky can offer another. And as you said, there's so much in this book. And in our book, we felt, we had a page limit, which I think we exceeded. One point I would mention is like the impact and uncertainty of accelerating change in the 21st century. Things are changing so quickly. We know technological change, the latest thing is now AI, chat GPT and all this stuff. All these things changes are coming and coming. Demographics, social change, everything we're seeing, economic change, environmental change, climate change, all of which are interrelated. So I think it's really important for those influences to be recognized in the comprehensive plan. And we actually lay out a couple of ways of doing that in the implementation chapter in terms of how to account for uncertainty from the beginning, from the inventory analysis all the way through, and then to inform your vision, goals, strategies, and implementation. So that's one I would highlight, making sure you account for the uncertainty of change. And by the way, that includes shocks like the pandemic, which was, changed how we're doing things overnight. So we have to be thinking about and preparing for things like that.
So I think one thing I would add that we present in the book, and it's something we've captured from contemporary practice in planning in the early part of the 21st century already, and that is to use various evaluation lenses as you work on your goals, policies, and actions. There's three that we lift up in particular. So a climate lens, an equity lens, and a health lens. And we spent some time, we do introduce those distinctly in the book because that's kind of how they're being used right now in the practice. David and I played a little bit. Well, can we bring them together? And rather than a lens, it's like a prism that brings all three together. They overlap quite a bit. I mean, if you look at what is often advocated to be used with doing an equity analysis, I mean, it really dovetails well with the health analysis. And obviously, you can see the strong relationship with a climate analysis and what is often laid out in a climate lens. So I would offer that those are important to have. And again, don't just use them when you get to addressing health or whatever, but have them from the get-go and be applying those through the entire process.
I really like the prism analysis or analogy. And before we go, how can our listeners get a copy of your book?
So we would recommend getting in touch with the publisher, so Routledge Press. If you go to their website and either tag in David's name or mine, David Rouse, Rocky Piro, or the title of the book, The Comprehensive Plan, Sustainable, Resilient, and Equitable Communities for the 21st Century, you'll find the book available there. And every once in a while throughout the year, Routledge will do a special discount rate on its planning publications. We should note that this book is actually part of the APA planning series. So we're delighted to have that recognition and relationship with the professional association.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you guys. This was a wonderful conversation.
Indeed. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Well, that wraps up our episode with authors David Rouse and Rocky Piro on their book, The Comprehensive Plan, Sustainable, Resilient, and Equitable Communities for the 21st Century. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate, review, and share the show. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Booked on Planning.